This is Horam with Horam's Quorum, and I'm happy to say that my guest today is Vineet Shahani. Vineet is director of legal at Google, where he joined from Nest, where he was attorney number two. So he's grown Nest, been a part of its growth and its success, and so he's had a lot of success himself, and he's pretty humble about it. And when I was getting to know attorneys and getting to know people in the tech world and asking people, what attorneys should I get to know in the tech world? So many people said, you got to talk to Vineet. And I'm glad I did. Vineet and I have talked to her a few times now, and he's somebody that I always walk away feeling energized from because he has such a dynamism and enthusiasm for pulling information from different parts of the world, from different practice areas. He's not limited to tech. He's not just an attorney. He's thinking much broader than that. So I think the things he talks about here will be interesting to a lot of people who are trying to have a rich career and really move between different spaces. We'll talk about the political world. We'll talk about the tech world and some of the interesting connections he's able to make between those spaces because he's such a creative and open-minded person who just genuinely is interested in other people. So with that, that's enough preamble. I think we can proceed to hear about Vineet.
Okay, Vineet, I'm glad that we're doing this. We've talked a few times now, and I just have really enjoyed your worldview, and I like the way that you think about your success, and like how much you've broken it down into principles and made it something that's successful. So I just wanted to talk to you about a bunch of things, but we can start with, I figured that we start with a story that you shared recently about something that wasn't a success, because we can talk a lot about your successes, but I think this might be more interesting. And you said that you're applying for in-house jobs, and at one of them you're told you were overqualified as an attorney. I don't feel like that's something that people hear too often when they're applying. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, and actually, if you want to step back for a second, I mean, I can give you my journey in very pithy fashion. I mean, I kind of graduated college in 2000 during a boom. I lost my first job in consulting in a bust in 2001. I kind of escaped to law school and came out during another boom in 2005 and met with challenges in finding jobs in 2009 in the last downturn. And so kind of, as you can see, I've come out of school during boom times. I've hit busts in the middle of my journey. And so sort of the era that you're asking about is a time, this is basically when I had been at a law firm. I'd been at Latham for almost 4 years as a corporate associate, and I wanted to go in-house, but that coincided with the last bust downturn, and they were, layoffs were happening, and highly qualified lawyers were applying for jobs probably levels below them just because they wanted to have a secure place to land. And so I was out looking for in-house, my first in-house jump from Latham to a company in that time period. And I looked for dozens and dozens of jobs. I mean, I applied to be a recruiter at Axiom. I applied to jobs at big blue chip companies and also tiny no-name companies that you've never heard of. And one of the companies I looked at, because I kind of gotten through enough doors being shut, was this division of Tyco, which was making steel pipes at the time, in the south side of Chicago. I was living in Chicago at the time. And I went through several rounds. I was in the factory. I was going to be this associate counsel at this steel factory, basically. And at the end of it, they chose somebody else. And the feedback was, you're overqualified for this job. And, I'd been underqualified. I'd been overqualified. That was just the era we were in at that time.
And so, that was a rough market then. So then what did you do to hurdle yourself into the next role? So, I mean, really tight market. You had to, do something strategic. What did you do?
Yeah, I mean, look, I can't say that it wasn't a tough time at the moment. At that time, I mean, I was kind of a new dad at the time. The economy's low. knew I wanted to get out of a law firm. I ended up taking a job at a small financial technology company. The word fintech wasn't really on the scene back then, in Chicago, which was far from the capital of technology. But what appealed to me about it was that I was going to be the second lawyer. I was going to own all the commercial and product sides of the business. And the GC was a litigator, so I knew she was going to give me a ton of rope. The CEO was like 29 years old. It was an engineering heavy company. So I decided to get over myself and not worry about the brand and really just go for the opportunity and the narrative. Because I guess in the back of my mind, I really felt like this could be a stepping stone. And so I wouldn't say that I had ultimately at that point, I was looking for a life raft, and this one kind of came to me. But in hindsight, it was a great move, because a year there is what propelled me into the current career I have in Silicon Valley. And I actually don't think, if I had stayed at Latham and tried to pitch myself to the jobs I looked for the following year, which included Apple, which is where I ultimately went, I'm not sure I would have been as compelling of a candidate. Mm-hmm. So I think taking a chance on myself there, looking at the substance of the role as opposed to just the brand name, really ended up helping me out a lot.
So when you said narrative, tell me more about that. So you were thinking prospectively in terms of the narrative is this the narrative that you tell yourself, or is this a narrative that you are for the eventual goal that you had of, say, moving into another tech role? Tell me about what that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of narrative to me is important, because we're all, when we make career switches, and when I say career switches, I mean even job switches, we have to convince ourselves that we're doing something that makes sense. And sometimes it's easy. It's like, oh, I got a job at Facebook. Of course that makes sense. Everybody knows Facebook and they pay well, and it's a nice brand on top of other brands I already have. But sometimes it's not that easy. You're trying to make a job to go to a startup. You're trying to make a decision to switch career paths completely and get out of the law. You're taking a public interest job. In my case, you're taking a job at a company that people had never heard of, in an industry that you weren't even sure you had any interest in. And so I had to look at the job and say, how am I going to sell this to the next job, right? And that was what I guess it was a combination of being turned down enough by the more conservative choices, the more stable choices, and getting around to the fact that I can sell this thing. I didn't know how long it would take. I mean, I don't think you should ever take a job thinking you're going to leave it, because then it's probably a bad decision. But I knew it wasn't the last job, and I knew even Chicago was increasingly looking like, not going to be the place I was going to stay for the rest of my career. And so, but I got comfortable with the fact that, hey, the elements of this job, tech, the culture at the company, the kind of the age of the people that were there, and just kind of the younger vibe of the place. I knew that would be relevant for other tech companies, even on the West Coast. And that's how I ultimately decided to leave a very white shoe, kind of nice branded place to go to a no-name kind of, small company.
So how, it seems like you were able to get over the hurdle of status really effectively. And I think status is an interesting concept, because I think that particularly in law, status is such a big component of the practice. I think so much of the, it seems like so often the status of a role and the desirability of the role are heavily correlated. I think in other domains, there can be trade-offs. I mean, something like, working in the government, I think a lot of times is a high status thing, but it's not necessarily, it's not high income, for instance. So there's some certain trade-offs, but I think a lot of people can see in law, okay, well, it seems like things are correlated. Okay, status and income, quality of work, these are all correlated. So how did you think about how to set aside the concept of status in order to pursue the goals that you had? Because I feel like a lot of people, whether they realize it or not, get hung up on status. Because I don't know about you, but I get a lot of people that reach out to me expressing an interest in moving into big law. And now my question for them is, well, why do you want to get a big law? And I think so often it's because they think it's the right thing to do because it's easy thing to sell. It's easy to sell to themselves. It's easy to sell to their family members to say, okay, this is why I did that, is, because you can't go wrong with this. So how did you navigate past that?
The thing is that I think I'm probably as into status as the next person. I mean, I'm definitely not above, using brands and things as a shortcut of how to evaluate potential candidates or evaluate their experience. I mean, at some level, or, we all love going to a cocktail party and having somebody kind of recognize something that we've done. I mean, there's, even if you don't admit it, I mean, everybody's got that sort of vanity to them. I would say, though, that for me, and again, I can't claim that I was thinking this exactly when I was making these choices, but in retrospect, using brand and the sort of kind of the what like the big brand names kind of, to have those as a goal eventually, but not necessarily think you need to have immediate gratification and get to that right away. I mean, a lot of the people that contact me because they see brands like, Apple and Nest and Google, they're sort of like calling me to try to figure out how to get a job there. And my advice is always, it depends on their background, but a lot of times they're, 3 years into their career or 5 years into their career, and they might be in a law firm, and they might be in a pretty law firmy practice, like, antitrust or something that doesn't lend well to like just jumping into a, corporate counsel role. And I spend a lot of time talking to them I tell them a little bit about my story, but I'm like, you don't have to hit a home run, right? You could hit a single. I mean, you can go to a stepping stone that will open the doors to that eventual, like Amazon or Facebook or Microsoft or Google or whatever it is that you think is the pedestal you need to get to. It's healthy to keep those types of things in your long-term mind. It's unhealthy to think that there are shortcuts to those things. I mean, there's always stories of people that get there faster, but I think it's more healthy to kind of keep it in mind, but don't let it block you from doing better things in the near term that can ultimately get you there faster, and will have you be a better lawyer or, a better professional when you get there, because those experiences that you had are going to make you better. And in my case, I do think I'm better at the jobs that I've had at these big brand name places because I spent time in things like this financial services company I mentioned, or even between Apple and Google, I was at Nest, and obviously that's something people now know. But when I joined, it was just making an expensive thermostat, and it was 100 people with, interesting backgrounds, but far from a certain thing. When you think about the big players that were already in that market, and the low odds of a startup at that stage succeeding, it's far from a sure thing.
And consumer products are super hard to get right. So yeah, a lot of things had to line up. If they line up, it was a big success like it was, but yeah, there was a lot to have to line up. So then let's take a company like Google. I imagine that, a significant number of people there, your counterparts, are people who maybe they're at big firms, and maybe, this was their direct move, or maybe they were at another large tech company like Amazon or something like that, and now they're at Google. So maybe there's any number of people that weren't at a smaller company that were at that single, as you put it. So what do you think it is about your perspective that's, whether or not that's true? I'm just saying that maybe that's true, and maybe that's a jumping point to answer this question, but what is it about that experience that you have that gives you a different perspective over someone who didn't have the experience of working at a smaller, scrappy company, maybe outside of Silicon Valley?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, both between Latham and Apple, and then even at Nest before it was acquired, I'm writing my own forms. I'm obviously you can always kind of get law firms involved, but like most of my day is kind of not being too good for anything. Somebody comes to me with like, a citation because our landscaping is, kind of disturbing the neighbors. I mean, I deal with that all the way up to a major technology access deal for the company that's like going to kind of supercharge our roadmap to put, a critical product out. I mean, I think that sort of scrappy, I'm not too good for anything attitude is really valuable, and it's even valuable. It's in many ways it's even more valuable when you get to some of these places that are full of, like the Googles of the world, that are full of accomplished people that have all these kind of gold-plated resumes. Because at the end of the day, when those are your peers, genuineness sticks out, and being able to trust people and get along with people, and I think people with those attitudes of I really want to do what's best for the business. I'm willing to kind of roll my sleeves up, and even if I'm several clicks above somebody that's working on something, I'm going to read it closely and get in the weeds, and I have the technical skills because of having been through this. Like, I can sit here and get right in the document and mark things up, and I can, all of my comments are more actionable, I think, in general, in my current role, because when it was just me or two lawyers, like, every email had to be written with, basically, actually filled with purposeful content that, all right, the next step is to do this. It wasn't just like pontificating from a glass tower. It was like, here's the red line, and it's okay to send as long as this happens and that happens. And everything is kind of tied up in a bow for the person who's receiving it. And I think when you are at law firms, or when you're only at certain big legal departments and things, sometimes you can get away with just kind of stopping at a certain point and not really passing and delegating and stuff like that. And I think I've benefited from my experiences. I don't do that as often.
So, with someone, let's say someone has the goal of going to Google, then, and you're advising them, hey, instead of fixing so much on this goal, think about the process, think about the skills you get and the narrative that you can construct around that, and how you'll sell that, how you'll get valuable skills and how you'll sell that. So prospectively, how can someone size up the kinds of ways they can sell an experience? I mean, because it seems like that's important, that, if you're heading into something, you define it as a good opportunity by saying, hey, here's the things I'll be able to sell about that to some other domain. How does someone think about that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's never too early to start looking at job descriptions and looking at LinkedIn and the backgrounds of people that are at places you want to be. It helps you kind of think about the language you should start thinking about, and the experiences you should start looking for. But at the end of the day, when you're applying for something, you've only got the background you've got. You can't make up a set of experiences you don't have. But what you can do is you can position it in a much better way, right? I'm always getting resumes from people that reach out, and I'm always happy to look at these things. And a lot of times, people are applying for a product counsel role at Google, and it still looks like a resume that's looking for a law firm job, or looking for something that's not on point. So I think you got to be able to think about what's the role that you're looking for, and what are the things that they would like to see, and do you have any of those things? And even if you don't have them on point, can you make up for them because you know how to talk about it? An example is, when I would interview people at Apple, I would always, obviously, having a certain set of core legal skills was necessary, but most of my interview was about what they knew about Apple, and what they knew about product technology. Questions I would have would be things like, what do you read in your free time? To keep up with technology. Mm-hmm. I wanted to hear people talk about certain blogs that they might follow, or different methods they had for staying on top of things. Or I'll ask at Apple. I used to always ask in interviews, tell me about your favorite Apple product, or a favorite Apple business decision, and why is that? Why is that something you care about?
What was your favorite response to that?
Well, the worst response I would get would be, people would tell me about how much they loved the iPad because it was the first time they could see their grandparents interact with technology, and it was so simple and easy to use. And to me, that's a terrible answer, because that's I could walk into an Apple store and somebody off the street would probably give an answer like that. The better answers were people that had thought about our app store and had constructive criticism or thoughts on why the app store was a limitation for companies or was an opportunity for companies. Some people had talked about our impact on, kind of cross-border trade or manufacturing or, obviously I happen to sit in the hardware area. And so if anybody was thinking about the job they were applying to, they might make their responses more relevant for those areas. But that to me wasn't a requirement. Like a bad answer might be some oversimplified answer about marketing. A good answer might be how we've really pushed the envelope on, less words, less claims, more imagery. And, and why is that important? Like, how has that made Apple more competitive and a better, more distinct brand and all that? You can just tell when someone talks through a question like that, whether they are pretty analytical and passionate and how they might stand up in a room where they're getting criticism or they're the only no in the room and the rest of the executives are like, really want to just kind of not pay attention to this point out of legal. You can tell by a response. I mean, another interview question, if we're just on the subject of like good interview questions I always had, and I still have asked this question mostly, is sort of like, hey, I get your resume, like I've reviewed it and a lot of it makes sense, but I really want to hear about, give me the biggest fuck you moment in this resume. Like when you did something, and it doesn't have to be professional, like something that you did where people told you they thought you were a little nuts, right? Or they thought that you were doing something that just wasn't conventional. And this harkens back to like why I left Latham to go work at a kind of small fintech lending company that most people at Latham kind of rolled their eyes on. Or why when I walked in at Apple and had to like tell even my dad, who was obsessed with Apple and was so proud that his son was working at Apple, and I had to go tell him I was working on a thermostat, and he called it a thermometer for like 6 months. Like he didn't even call it a thermometer. I think at some point he realized it wasn't a thermometer, but I think he loved that it pissed me off, and he was still mad at me that I had left Apple and he couldn't, and like so. But I mean, those are kind of fuck you moments, right? Where you're sort of like, hey, I got to take a chance on myself, right? I know that not everybody's going to see how this makes sense, but if I keep doing things that everybody thinks makes sense, like I might be missing some incredibly great forks in the road,
So when else did you evaluate and figure out that you had a fork in the road? Like when else did you realize, hey, like I've just got to go my way on this and double down on my voice? What's telling me to go in this direction against the conventional wisdom?
I mean, so, obviously the jobs, I mean, those two things, I would say that my decision to leave Latham and go to the small company, I give myself less credit on that because frankly, we were in a recession and your back's against the wall and you make those, I would credit that as much as I would credit me being some savant about the future. I think the decision to leave Apple and go to Nest was entirely a savant-y decision. And it was because Apple was doing awesome. I had tons of reasons to stay, a great career trajectory, very senior executives there that were interested in me staying, a huge offer to stay that was well above what I was getting, and I loved the company and I loved the people there and I still left. And I think that was a time when I feel like, it more than anything else I've done, I put myself on my own back and I sort of said, you're just going to go do this. And what was great was when I got to Nest, it was at that time, a lot of Apple people too. And you were working around a lot of other people that had chips on their shoulders because they had walked away from Apple or maybe some other companies. And they probably were telling other people that, having to explain to other people why they did such a thing. And like, it just made you want to succeed that much more, right? Made you want, like, that's the thing about doing something that's unconventional. It's the reason entrepreneurs and startup founders, I haven't done that before and I have immense respect for those people, but most of the time they're a little crazy in that sense. Like they're trying to prove somebody wrong, right? They're trying to they have a chip on their shoulder however they got it. And that's what is relentless about them, and why they keep going into investors and getting rejected. And they keep going into, having V1 of their product not make sense. Then they have to pivot to V2 and V3. Like, it's that motivation, right? To be great and to prove other people wrong. And I think as lawyers, it's hard for us to find that. Like, we picked a risk averse profession. Yeah. So like, you have to generate that, right? You can't, that doesn't just come naturally to the average lawyer.
So speaking of generating, one part of what you're talking about is the importance of that vision and being someone who has a vision. Sorry about that. And that's one part of it. But I think what you can also come up as a narrative from that is the importance of a community of people. So, that's so much, what Peter Thiel talks about from 0 to 1 is, just finding the smallest number of people. A startup is the smallest number of people that have some unique worldview. There's insiders and outsiders. And so I think that's, and that's a view I think that's pretty common in tech. So it's just like that's kind of a widely understood concept is, when you go to startup, it's a group of like-minded people steering in the same direction. What I think is now evolving is now you're seeing more and more people thinking about community and finding masterminds and groups of people, however, whatever tactical approach you think to that, to find the like minds doing what you're doing. And I'm really interested in that because, as you know, that's something that I'm working on, with my, South Asian legal project. But so I'm kind of interested to hear from you the importance of finding like-minded people on a mission and just getting that mutual support and learning, tools like, hey, like, how are you thinking about this? And, how do you exchange ideas and exchange motivation with a pool of people, whether it's at a company or one that you create and you find? Tell me about the importance of that and maybe tips for how someone can find that.
Yeah, I mean, look, community is super important. And I mean, I'll be the first to admit, like, I'm still trying to get my head around how we work with community in this virtual world versus, the traditional sense of being in a room together and, shaking hands and eye contact and all that stuff. That's been hugely important to me. I mean, it was one of the reasons I left. Apple, I feel like I had this great community, but I also felt like there was a whole aspect of Silicon Valley, like people that were really taking a risk and had, a lot of uncertainty ahead of them that I wasn't participating in when I was at a big company, right? And that's one of the reasons I jumped off. And frankly, I got the job at Nest because I was an Apple person, and that's sort of the majority of the people that were there when I got there. I mean, I think you do have to it's hard at the beginning of your career because you're generating that, but at some point, the decisions you make before is what opens up what your community is in the future, because, it's going to be those people that and the networks. And that kind of is why, I know we might talk about this later, but that's why I think you have to be involved in things outside of your career. Mm-hmm. Whether that's, community service or, the arts or politics or, any of these things like that hopefully is in many ways, that's a more controllable way to get community than just hoping you show up at a workplace that has people that you get along with, right? Because you can't always bank on that.
So that's interesting because, when I focused on community in my career, first of all, community was the thing that I think has charged me the most in my career. And that's why I'm spending a lot of time. That's why you and I are talking, is because, this is something that can be shared with a community of people. And I'm just enjoying spending time on relationships and learning from people about relationships. So, but I've always thought about, the community that I focused on was so related to the work that I was doing. That's it's something I've advocated for is, that's a great way to progress in a profession, is to target a pool of people that you just want to spend more time with. And for me in Chicago, it was an Inn of Court, the Richard Lynn Inn. And so, but now I'm thinking to myself, okay, so I've got this great pool of IP attorneys, and that's this pool of people that I know. But, in terms of expanding my worldview, now, I'm doing different things to find different pools of people now. So I'm kind of switching gears now with how I'm thinking about community. It sounds like early on you were thinking about focusing on community outside of the work you were doing. So it's really interesting to hear about that. So I have a hard time wrapping my head around how that's paid off in a career, but so we can get into that. I think the starting point is maybe talking about that outside community. So I think in your case, I think what you're referencing is your work in politics and in organizing campaigns. So let's just jump into that.
Yeah, and I'm just closing this door because my third grader loves opening and closing doors and not following through. So, well, yeah, I mean, and look, community is a tough thing. I mean, I can see what you're saying about wanting to kind of get into a different set of communities. I guess my simple answer to like a very tough, broad question is that like that more than even picking jobs and career paths and that's a super amorphous area that is just fluid beyond belief. And so, I mean, in my case, and again, I don't know that I was as Machiavellian and intentional about this, but at the end of the day, like I've always been interested in politics. It's why I was going to major in political science. I didn't end up doing that. I majored in business. I went to a consulting firm, but when that got hit by the dot-com bust in 2001, I went and actually interned in the Bush White House. Mm-hmm. So at the time I was more conservative leaning, and I did that arm in arm with like kids in college, and I was like 2 years out of college, but I did that just because I had a passion for Washington and wanting to like be close to power and that kind of thing. And I passed up on an opportunity to stay there longer to go to law school ultimately. And my whole time in Washington, even when I kind of evolved from being more right-leaning to more left-leaning, like was filled with going to school, doing the day job, but then attending tons of events around politics, fundraisers, campaign involvement, helping out and learning like wherever I could. I lived with Hill staffers all the time. So like I was like, even though I was always the one with like the sort of law firm, like which one doesn't fit in kind of job, I sort of always kept I kept up with the lingo and and so for me, I always thought I'd go into something political full time. And then I ended up leaving Washington in 2008, around the time my daughter was born. And when I got to Chicago, it was tough because I had this huge network in DC. DC is just full of people that want to talk politics all the time. And then I come to Chicago, I don't have the network. Everybody in 2009, when I got there, was leaving Chicago to follow Obama to go into his administration. Mm-hmm. And I come back to a city that's like kind of empty of like political energy, frankly. And I ended up reaching out to then Deputy Treasurer Raja Krishnamurthy, who I had met at a South Asian Bar Association event, actually. And Raja, all I said to him in my ping was like, hey, you've been around Chicago politics for a while. I got to imagine you're going to do something cool next. When you do, just let me know. And he wrote back to me and said, hey, can we meet at the sandwich shop at like 8 a.m., later in the week? And
the sandwich shop.
It's called Corner Bakery. So it's not some, I was going to, I didn't want to like say Corner Bakery. It's so corporate. I was like, it's not some
Al's beef or something, but no good. Okay.
Yeah, it's not some hip, super like Chicago original. It's a Corner Bakery at Washington and Wells.
Great pastries, but yes.
Yeah, and so Corner Bakery at Washington and Wells, it's still there. So basically, I show up, Raja's there, and one of his best friends from high school is there, and the three of us are sitting there, and we start talking, and it's pretty clear Raja wants to run for state controller, which is one of the like 4 or 5 constitutional offices statewide in Illinois. And I knew nothing about the office. I barely knew Raja. And the three of us are just sitting there with notepads, and we just start taking notes about what we got to do and how do we even start a campaign. He had never run for anything before. And that's kind of how it started. I mean, and I think my reasonings for wanting to work on it was, number one, I was interested in being involved in politics all along. But number two was pretty selfish. Like, I knew Raja was a really, he was going places. He had a great network. I was there at the ground level, and I knew I was going to meet a ton of great people in the process, in addition to getting the cool experience. And so even if we lost, and we ultimately did lose in the primary by a hair, I got a ton. I was going to get a ton of great experience and meet a ton of great people, which both happened. And obviously, I ended up leaving Chicago a year later and coming out to Silicon Valley. Raja and Mark still work together. Mark is the other person that was there. He's Raja's chief of staff, and Raja's obviously just was reelected last week to his third term in Congress. So, it sort of, those guys obviously had a great run, and I obviously, I got a lot out of it too, and just went in a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think the theme already we're seeing here is, you're thinking in terms of, what's the payoff profile of this move? I think just we can see in several moves that you've made, you're saying to yourself, okay, what's the upside and what's the downside? And you are betting in terms of things that have higher upside. Going to the financial services company, lots of upside in that move in terms of the skills that you gain. Going from established blue chip company like Apple to Nest, a lot of upside, and then this politics move even earlier of like betting on a candidate whether or not they would lose or not. It kind of reminds me of like Cory Booker's his run in Newark. It was a really smart move for him politically because I was from New Jersey, so I can say this, but Newark was in shambles, and so he knew there's little downside to making that move. If he didn't make a dent in Newark, big deal. It was already so hard. But any positive changes he can make, big deal. So I think that's a really smart move in politics and other domains. So we can talk more about that sort of payoff profile. I mean, I guess fast forwarding, this is kind of skipping around from talking about politics, but like, how are you thinking about that now? I mean, I know that you are an investor, and so that that's something that maybe that's your outlet for that. Is there anything you're doing professionally, otherwise, that is allowing you to think in terms of how can I do this thing and take the step forward that has this same kind of payoff profile?
Yeah, and just to close the loop on Raja, like, again, to me, that's another example of, I think there's a lot of people that would have been like, state controller, like what does that person do? And might have been more interested in a sexier race, like somebody running for Congress or somebody with a higher brand profile already. I at the time, again, I sort of looked at it as the candidate, like the substance that was going to be involved, like. So I think just not lining up an opportunity based on the brand and what's there today, but thinking about it more forward looking, it applies in jobs, it applies in politics. I think looking back, one of the reasons I always encourage anybody that's, I think a lot of people are now even more so than ever politically interested, but I always encourage people to go work on a campaign or go out there and try to meet some younger candidates that are, not yet there, but you can tell have all the tools to be there. Is it's kind of like betting on a startup. I mean, you're getting in early. You're getting into a small circle of trust early that person's never going to forget. That person, no one decides to run for any office, controller, Congress, whatever, unless they already have a pretty good Rolodex and they already have, there's already a ton of things you can benefit from by being associated with that person. I mean, you can't get elected otherwise. So in Raja's case, like he already had such great, rich networks from his time working for Obama. He was a partner at Kirkland and Ellis at the time, right before he became deputy treasurer. Obviously, he had been in government. He had all these CEOs and other people around Chicago that I got a chance to meet, because often Raja would be like, all right, here's a group of people I can't get to, or I met all these people at this event last night. Like, you want to call them and tell them you work with me and see if they have any interest in donating or doing something else for the campaign. And I was always eager to do that, because to me, why else would a mid-level associate at a law firm have a chance to talk to a CEO of a company? And never. But I would quickly go to these meetings and meet them and go to their office and and sit down. And after a couple minutes of talking about the campaign, it would naturally move over to like me. And of course, this is where you need to be, really good about your socializing and like be kind of savvy in different situations with people of different levels of, stature. But, it got to the point at the end of a lot of those conversations where they became my contact and my friend. Right. And I mean, I still have tons of those contacts in Chicago, and it helped me be better as a lawyer and an executive counselor when I got put in positions where I had to counsel senior people. It's helped me professionally. It's helped me continue to be a good fundraiser for other candidates. It's just kind of a win all around, getting involved in a campaign at that state. And I think it's something, we talk about community. I mean, it's a more controllable way to find people that you'd have no reason to come into contact with.
But that you have like-minded worldview with.
Like-minded worldview, or even not like-minded, but ultimately like open your eyes to like, oh, wow, that person really isn't interested in this campaign. And here's why. I mean, we had a couple of those. I had some really rough meetings, I remember back then, where people had very specific reasons why they didn't want to get involved, or they didn't like the other candidate better, or they just hated politics generally because they thought it was, so, but that's all formative. Like that's all, that's all learning. That's great.
So who is the most interesting person you met? You don't have to say, if you don't want to say, you don't have to stop who it is, but who, describe the most interesting person you met, or the most interesting conversation you had. Because I think that will be helpful to kind of wrap our heads around, okay, like what does it mean? So sure, like you're, fourth year associate, whatever, and you're meeting people, and that's great. But like, what did you actually experience in these conversations so someone can wrap their head around what that's like?
Yeah. I mean, look, I met, again, Raj, I had he had a number of lawyer contacts. So I met like a very, very famous class action plaintiff's lawyer who's, done very well and is actually kind of actually made his name heavily on like kind of coming after tech companies and such. And I met him, I sort of met him earlier on, and really tough personality. Like, I mean, he's good at his job for a reason. I mean, he's just no bullshit. And, you don't know what you're going to walk into. Like, actually, it's interesting, but like, that was the roughest meeting I had. He had no interest in supporting, like it kind of became clear he wasn't really going to be interested in even contributing or sort of doing anything with the campaign. But like, it's a formative meeting for me because I remember going in feeling like I had probably had a streak of like good meetings with senior partners or with other people who were like, yeah, of course, like the campaign sounds great and Raj is great and whatever. And I get to a guy who literally, just like was just so had all these reasons why he had no interest in politics generally and in this thing. And he had all these complaints and he was very curt and like lots of F-bombs. And I remember walking out of there feeling like we had kind of dejected about it. But I then went to Apple, a year and a half later is when I sort of was sitting in a corporate environment that is a pretty rough place in its own right. I mean, it is a really secretive, hard charging, results oriented, no bullshit, like, expletives in meetings, like, you gotta, go big or go home kind of thing. And a meeting like that was like formative for me, right? Like not everybody's going to like you and you're not going to always be the good guy in the room. And so, there's an example of like, there were things like I got tons of friends and like get all this huge, but like there was also rough moments that actually I think make me a better lawyer, a better counselor, a better professional.
I love that because, I think about my own experience in politics. So, I worked, I was a canvasser, so I raised money knocking on doors. And then later I switched to being a field organizer in 2004. I think we were on opposite ends of the political spectrum back then. But, so it was a great experience to learn how to get a $200 check from a total stranger. Like I was a 21-year-old kid in jeans, just getting, big chunks of money from people's cash sometimes, just from total strangers. So that was cool to be able, okay, like I'm learning this tool of persuasion. I'm learning how to have these conversations. That's great. So the wins were great, but maybe just as useful was, the people who slammed the door on you or got in your face. You don't think about that at that time, but those are the things that really paved the way. Now when it comes to cold calling, if you tell me, hey, Quorum, here's 50 people you have to cold call, I'm like, no problem. Just like if 49 of them hang up on me, I really don't care. I just know how this works. And for so many of the people in our field, it's been a very tracked life. It's built on a lot of success and a lot of yeses. They don't realize it. They think, oh, I'm a litigator and read some no's. It's not the same. Like opposing counsel saying no, a judge saying no. It's not the same. It's just someone rejecting who you are. Like people will reject you, say, okay, well, the rules of civil procedure bar what you just did. Okay, fine. But like people just saying, no, I just don't like you. That's something totally different. So yeah, I think that is a great experience. You don't think about it in those terms at the time, but those are the kinds of, I think we're talking about right now some of the benefits of what you might call the downsides of the role or the failures. I think, and that's something that you alluded to earlier is, how much you can extract out of failure and the opportunities in failure or setback.
100%. And I mean, that's why for me, obviously I haven't spoken very much about my current role, which is a great role, and Google is a great company, and I'm incredibly fortunate to be there. But the reason I'm not talking about it that much is because as of late I haven't hit as much failure, right? I mean, I like, the company's going well. I mean, I've had the fortune of being part of a good career trajectory there. I love the colleagues, so I'm not talking about it not because I'm not proud of it or it's not interesting, but because I actually think the more useful instruction for a lot of people, especially attorneys that are just getting started, is where I came from. And the fact that this is now if you want to call this a downturn, this is the oddest of downturns because of where our stock market is and some other things. But if we're going to just call this a third kind of economic, kind of some economic challenge, I mean, I lived through the last two, and they're very much a part of what I think about when I'm making hard decisions or talking to executives or looking at people that reach out to me on LinkedIn that I don't even really know, that are reaching out and saying, hey, I read your background and I think you could help me kind of think about next steps or connect me with people. And I always take those calls. And I had 2 of them yesterday. And it's mainly because I did that when I was their vintage, and it got me to where I was. It helped me. And a lot of those people that I talked to, I still found a way to, I mean, some of them are still great friends and mentors. And I just think you got to pay it forward. And for me, selfishly, it actually gives me fuel to continue pushing myself forward, right? I mean, is like if all I see are people that have quote made it, I mean, I don't know if that's a real word. I don't know if anybody ever quote makes it, but for the sake of argument, we'll call the people that I work with right now people that have made it. Like, I need to pull myself out of that, and I have to look at, a broader view, and that's what I get out of hopefully helping people, but selfishly, they help me too. And I think that's sort of always been kind of something I've kept in mind.
So thinking about, so you're on the other end of getting these requests of, hey, can we talk? And it's great that you want to take those, it sounds like you'll take, them as you get them. But in terms of the people that are reaching out to you, and these are people that should just be reaching out, period, in general, to, some pool of people that they're trying to get to know, to, in line with what you were suggesting earlier about, finding opportunities and things that have that asymmetric payoff. So what are ways, you've done this a while now, that you've gotten used to, building, doing these outreach. So I guess 2 questions is, what are things people can do to improve their outreach? So I mean, like, you reach out to Raja and said, hey, let me know how I can help. Is there some, what made you, what did you think you could bring to the table? And then what, could someone be a little more intentional about sharing that they can bring to the table? And like, how can someone be a little more strategic about, how they can present themselves to a person Maybe we can just talk about that first.
I'm really glad you asked the question, because kind of like I was talking about when people would come interview at places like Apple and Google, and I feel like they would just be a bit clumsy in their preparation and not as thoughtful in their responses. I think there's a definite art to networking, and not just the networking, like especially networking in a virtual sense where you're kind of reaching out over LinkedIn. I think look, I'm one of those people that just responds all the time, but I know more often than not, people are not like that. And you have a much better chance of somebody responding to you and being eager to pick up the phone and talk to you or get coffee with you if you say something that's indicative of the fact that you've actually thought about why they would be a good person to talk to. So not just saying, hey, you've got a cool LinkedIn page, let's talk. It's sort of like, hey, I'm currently working on this and I'd like to be working on this. And it looks like you made a similar jump. Like, that's really fascinating to me. I think it just increases the likelihood of response. So then, all right, you've gotten the response and you've got the person on the phone or whatever, VC. And then, I think coming there, and there's obviously a little bit of like, kind of like this podcast, like sort of like us, there's some warm up and there's some trying to get to know the person. But then your goal is to get to like the crux of some substance, right? Because like you really like to learn some things from the person. You'd also like the person to start to take some investment in you, right? Because they sort of feel like you've got some moxie and you've got like something that they want to help out with. So there's like an art to like 30 minutes where like there's a little bit of warm up and you're sort of like, oh, I saw you're from Michigan, like I went to Michigan, whatever. And then there's sort of like have an objective of like specific things that the person did or the people that they know that you want to ask about. And then I think you got to leave time at the end of it to, make some asks. Because otherwise it's just like an interesting 30 minutes, but like, right. What'd you really get out of it? So I think your asks are usually like, hey, if you don't mind, I offer this prospectively, but I don't think people necessarily do. Like, hey, if you don't mind, like, if there's somebody in your network on LinkedIn or something that looks interesting for me, like, would you mind putting me in touch with them? That's a good thing to ask. Another good thing to ask is like, this is kind of where I'd like to go. Do you have anybody that has, you can think of that has a story like mine that would be good for me to talk to after you? And again, I'm telling you something that I do without the person asking, but I don't know that everybody would do that. Like, so whenever I'm talking to somebody, like yesterday, the person is at a law firm and feels like they're kind of stuck in a particular vertical. I immediately have the name of like two people that I know are kind of stuck in similar verticals and made a jump into something else. And I left the conversation being like, if you want, I'll introduce you to these two people. And, they're more specifically on point for what the challenges that you have. And I think, I think those are a couple of things that you can tangibly get out of a conversation, but it takes legwork. Like, you got to be up for having these conversations and then following up and saying thank you. And like, I get why people don't do as much of this. It's not, in addition to all the stuff you got to do for your job and family, like this networking stuff it's a lot of work. So, you got to do it with some purpose in mind, and, make use of the person's time that you're talking to, because likewise, they have other stuff they could be doing, if they weren't talking to you. So you've got to, make it worth their while as well.
So how have you made it easier for yourself to sustain relationships over time? Because I imagine with how busy you are and how experienced you are at this, it's got to become something that's more efficient. Like by now I consider myself to be someone who's experienced at working out. So it's very efficient for me to calendar in a 20-minute workout, whatever. Because I've gotten a lot of experience with this. There's not a lot of warm up and prep I need for it, a lot of question marks about how to approach it. So I imagine for someone as experienced as you, there's probably some set of habits or routines you have with growing your relationships and sustaining your relationships. So talk about that.
Yeah. So when I used to have a cafeteria at Google that I could host people in, I would have a goal of like 1 to 2 interesting coffees a month. And often that would be me playing the role of like reading an article about somebody interesting and shooting them an unsolicited invite or email and saying, hey, I really think what you did here is cool. It might be political in nature. It might not have anything to do with tech or whatever. And, you know, I don't know, the hit rate's half and half, you know, which is pretty good because back in the day.
What sort of people are this? These are just, yeah, what kind of people?
I mean, city councilmen or tech people, like you know, sometimes or VCs or whatever. Like it wouldn't be like, and it's not. I'm not trying to like. It would genuinely be that like they did. Like I read something. I wasn't looking for them, but like you know, I somebody that just got promoted to GC of an interesting company, and like I think it's cool, and I work between Mountain View and San Francisco, so like usually that's close to somebody. And so I always had that goal, and I've been doing that for years. And so, you know, Google's kind of paid for coffee for lots of people for me to talk to. But I'd like to think through those people, I've met candidates for a lot of jobs that we need. I mean, it's the same, you know, it's obviously I think it's a good use of your time in the workday, you know, however you do that. I think that, so I would make a goal of like doing that. I think something else I do, so I'm not a big like Facebook or social media person, but I actually get an email every day from Facebook or LinkedIn about birthdays. And I'm usually somebody that doesn't just write on somebody's wall because I don't actually really write anything on Facebook. That's my opportunity to send a ping to people that I haven't talked to in a while. And I'll just say something like, hey, I just saw it was your birthday today. Happy birthday. And it'll be an email. And I've done it for years, but I do it even more religiously in the pandemic. And that I've gotten, you know, on VCs and calls with people that I went to high school with that I haven't talked to in forever because I sent them an email on their birthday saying, you know, happy birthday. Am I covering like the 5,000 or whatever people in LinkedIn that I've got? No way. Like, but am I picking up some interesting conversations and having some interesting new people and new opportunities kind of flow through in aggregate by doing some of this stuff? Definitely. You know?
What's emergent from that? So let's get a little more specific about that. Is this just like totally free flowing? Because, you know, there's a trade-off, you know, between being free flowing and systematic. I mean, these days, you know, what's really popular in, you know, the Bay Area and Silicon Valley is, you know, note-taking apps and being really systematic about knowledge management. And I can see the appeal, and I've given some thought. You know, I use Evernote really heavily, and it's somewhat well organized, not particularly. There's a handful of notes I use really heavily. Okay. When it comes to reading, you know, I float between multiple books. I kind of follow what's interesting to me, and I try to find things that are just going to apply to the things I'm thinking about right now. So I have this kind of loose style that's, I think, pretty practical. And there's room for improvement, but maybe a little more systematic there. I'm not sure. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what's your style? Like, is there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when I was like back in the day when I was looking for jobs, you know, like, I mean, honestly, the last job I looked for was the fintech job in Chicago because, after the fintech job was Apple, really. Because since then, I've been in Silicon Valley for 10 years and, you know, I haven't really looked for jobs in a big way. But like back then we didn't have all these apps and things in 2009, but like I was, you know, I had an Excel spreadsheet and I was, you know, fairly organized about who I contacted and what we talked about in the generic sense and whatever. I'd say I'm not that systematic anymore. I mean, it's a lot more spray and pay, you know. I just sort of like, you know, obviously like I get an email and it might have like 15 people's birthdays and I'm only going to reach out to like 2 or 3. And clearly I'm biasing towards people that I think might be more interesting to stay in touch with. Cause you don't have enough time in the day and you don't, you know, like I was talking about maybe reaching out to 1 or 2 people a month. Like clearly there's some purpose to that. But I would say that the only like record keeping I have, if you're kind of getting to that level of like tacticalness, is just they're a LinkedIn contact. You know, like they're not even in my phone, frankly, because we probably didn't get to the point where I had enough texting or calling or emailing with them to even get them into my contacts, like in my phone. So it's really LinkedIn. Like if someone erased my LinkedIn, I think it would be damaging, because it is basically every person I've met through all these different wandering experiences.
So, we haven't talked a lot about tactics or principles, but that behind the tactics that you use for everyday life. I mean, I think we've talked some about, big picture concepts like, this whole like thinking about singles and thinking about the payoff that you can get from a move and how much upside there is. Okay, we talked a little bit about that. But in terms of day to day, I think that's kind of interesting. So, it sounds like, and I'm curious if you agree with this, it sounds like there are at least some ways in which you're opting for simplicity. So there's just a simplicity in the birthday. It's just elegant, just, people are happy that day to get the email, of course they're getting other congratulations, but
they're not getting that many emails. They're not getting that many emails, actually. They're getting.
So, I don't get a million emails on my birthday. So, and if I got one from Vineet, I'd feel pretty special, honestly.
He'd probably write you back, and maybe, that's it, right? Like, tactics like.
Talk about simplicity. I mean, that seems like maybe is simplicity like a premise you're thinking about, like what's the simplest way to do something or.
Yeah, so birthdays, like I said, you asked like, hey, how do you keep like thousands of contacts in the air and like in touch with them? And I said, I can't, and I don't think you can. But here's like a method of just, shooting into a barrel and hope, and just continuing to keep your, like, for me, and it's been even more valuable in the pandemic, like when I connect with somebody that I haven't talked to in 6 years, and here's somebody who, get to totally learn about how their life's been for the last 6 years and get to think of a thought that isn't related to the pandemic. Because like, I haven't talked to the person since back when we were able to just meet up at a restaurant. Like, so like, I think it's been very cathartic that way. But, I guess you get to a point, at least for me, where and maybe it's because I just didn't come up in an era where these apps and stuff were like as pervasive. And I wasn't as data driven as like I would say some of the younger, attorneys are at this point. I get more comfortable with just kind of doing what's, what feels like the right reach out or like the right thing, and kind of feel comfortable that like, hey, I can search my emails or I can search LinkedIn if I need to find that person again. I do think there's an element of memory to this though. Like I do have an uncanny way of remembering things about people, like, like where they're from. I usually remember what city, like now that you said you're from New Jersey, like I probably won't ever forget that. Like there's certain mnemonic devices that, I don't think I like intentionally do it. It's just, if somebody tells me where they're from or where they went to college or maybe a favorite sports team or something, like there's a decent chance I remember it, even if we had like a cocktail conversation and I don't talk to them for 4 years. And I think some of that is natural, but some of that is just interest. Like, I want to remember it, right? So I do. I think you can do the sort of more free-flowing kind of thing, and it can work, but it's lower percentage probably overall than being super organized with a database. It's also takes more of your mind to get right than somebody that can just rely on their notes, But I guess you get to a point where, especially when you introduce 3 kids into the mix, like I have, that you don't have the cycles to invest in that type of, the more systemic, system.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm kind of like you. I feel like, I have noticed younger people that are so data driven, as you say. And it's interesting. Like, I think, like you were talking about earlier, I think there's a lot to be said for just taking interest in younger people just to understand their worldview and what energizes them and get that energy from them. And so it's something that I'm interested in exploring because it's something that I feel like will be energizing, and it's a good challenge to think a little bit differently. But yeah, I kind of like the appeal of being a little looser. But having said that, I do think I buy into that whole getting things done framework of, if it's in your head at some level, it's a source of anxiety. You don't realize it that way. Because I really like, I've done a good job of not intaking a lot of politics in the past few years. I think I've done a really good job of managing my inputs in that way. And I saw a tweet from Paul Graham. He's like, yeah, I just feel like someone just killed a process that was just like running on 5% of my CPU for the past 4 years. And it's great because like I think that's a really apt way of thinking about it. It's like, yeah, I mean, just like at some level, of course, I have been thinking about politics. So there's somebody said, that's illustrative of this idea. Like if there's ways you can take things out of your head, it's worth doing. We only have a few minutes left, so it's okay if this is something we talk about very briefly. And if it's something that, we just kind of tantalize and maybe explore another time if we do that. But I'm curious, what role finances played in your evaluation of your move to Nest? Like, how did you size up your financial position? Because I think that's something that I'm pretty interested in. People that experience success is how they thought about their finances as tools for moving in the direction they want to go in. If you've had some fortune, because I think this position that, we were talking earlier about the importance of talking to people that are going from 0 to 1, but we also want to talk about tools for getting people from 1 to infinity. And, on the 1 to infinity front, so let's say there's any number of people who have experienced some degree of financial success. And now they're figuring, okay, well, now what? How do I make the most of this? What's this for? And so how did you use that? How did you think through your finances and how did that enable you to take the risks that you've taken?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Talk to people that are like 10 or 15 years out and ask them, take a poll of how many people have taken a dramatic pay cut. And I think your results there would be kind of surprising in the legal profession, right? Like, I think clearly people that are startup people or people that, just pursue alternative ways of like investing and that kind of thing have definitely seen the sort of troughs and the peaks. But lawyers, I think you talk to a lot of them, especially the ones that have gone like sort of the big law and then corporate route. They've never really had a meaningful reduction in salary like year over year. And I've done it twice, right? I went from Latham to the fintech company. That was, probably at least a 25% haircut in total comp, maybe 30%. And then I went from Apple to Nest. And again, I mean, I got a bunch of equity and stuff that like later was worth money, but like you didn't know that when you were signing up. I mean, it was just paper at the time. But my reduction in salary was more than 50%, right? And I had 2 kids. I had an expensive lease in Mountain View, and my wife's a physical therapist, and so she does a lot of great for the world, but she's not bringing in like tons of money. And so it was that. I mean, again, that was what I was kind of talking about before about why I think the move to Nest for so many reasons was, maybe my proudest professional move, because for so many reasons I shouldn't have done it, right? Like, and as a lawyer, I definitely shouldn't have done it because that's just not in our DNA to take risks like that. And we like counsel, we make a living off of counseling against taking risks. And I think ultimately, look, I had enough to like take care of what I needed to take care of. I would have never put my family in a position where I didn't. But I lost like all the bennies that come from a big company. I didn't have a 401k that year. I didn't have like my healthcare plan was dramatically different from what I had at Apple. Like I had no stock. I mean, I didn't have all this great restricted stock at Apple. I mean, I left it all on the table and I went to a company with, like I said, money that could have been worth nothing and a salary that was lower. My base salary at Nest, and I was 8 years out of law school, was lower than my first year at Latham salary. So, I mean, I think, look, I did that. I think if nothing would have happened with Nest and I was making that for 5 years, I probably would have had to sell out and go back to making money again. So money is important, but if you never, it's kind of like back to like, tell me the fuck you moment on your resume. Like if you never take yourself off the track, you never take a risk. And sometimes risks are correlated with not getting paid as much. And that could be taking a public interest job or a job in the government where you're going to obviously take less money, volunteering on things that takes away time when you could be, making more money. Like I mean, those are the things that are going to open the doors to like the great opportunities, you know? So I think you just have to get comfortable at some level that have enough money to like not compromise your family or your own core needs, but don't get obsessed with like the W-2 every year, because there's a whole lot of stuff that happened that year, hopefully, that were better because you didn't pick the highest income path, you know?
And I think that's also, it seems like that's part of a narrative. You know, like I hope your one's own narrative of themselves is like, hey, I tried something interesting. Because I've definitely met a number of equity partners at large firms. These are people pulling in well over $1 million. And they say to me, hey, you know, when I share some of the things I'm working on and directions I'm taking, they say, hey, I wish I took a risk. And this is even before I left, you know, from like Goodwin, like, you know, even before I left there, I heard so many equity partners, not all of them, but like more than I would have expected, say something like that. And I can see it in their face. I can see the palpable desire to have done something else, because the golden handcuffs, I think, is it's a little more complicated and nuanced than people realize. It's also about, you know, what motivates you, or how motivated you are to try something, and to just have a narrative of yourself that you tried, that you did things. Because after a while, it becomes kind of routine, you know, especially for a litigator. A lot of litigators are like, hey, you know what? I've kind of seen it all. I've already seen how this all pans out. I know the story. So I think they admire people that take those risks. And I think I definitely learned a lot from you about, you know, I consider myself to be someone who knows how to take those kind of asymmetric risks and who knows how to use outreach and talking to people to do that. But I definitely feel like I've added some arrows to my quiver, if that's expression. I feel like I've learned a little bit from you about how to do that. I'm excited to share this.
No, that's great.
Glad we did this.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's fun.
This is good.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop recording.